All right, good morning, powerful people. It is Jobs Numbers Day, and I want to welcome you to this Workers by the Numbers blogcast presented by the Power at Work blog. I'm Alicia Modestino, a professor of economics and public policy at Northeastern University, and the executive director of Community to Community, a new initiative to promote community engaged research to make social change. Today, we're going to talk about the latest jobs report, which was released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics just this morning. And joining me today is our panel of expert labor economists who regularly analyze these numbers every month and offer their insights to advise policymakers, practitioners, and workers about the labor market. First up is Dr. Elise Gould, who is the senior economist and director of health policy research at the Economics Policy Institute. Welcome, Elise.
Thank you.
And Dr. Teresa Ghilarducci, who is the Irene and Bernard L. Schwartz Chair in Economic Policy and Analysis at the New School for Social Research. Hi, Teresa.
I'm so honored to be with both of you today.
I love it. Whenever we have a panel going on of all female economists, I feel extra powerful on Jobs Day. All right, let's do the numbers. So job growth, the economy created 275,000 jobs in February, which was far above the 200,000 that economists were expecting, although in line with the gains of only 229,000 in January and 290,000 in December. Those are revised down from their previous report, so we'll probably talk about that in a little bit. For comparison, payroll employment increased by an average of 255,000 in 2023, so we're still in a strong job market. And well above the historic average of 70 to 100,000 jobs that just keeps the wheels going here in the economy. In terms of industries, for much of the past year, the lion's share of employment gains have been concentrated in only three sectors: healthcare, leisure and hospitality, and government. February's jobs report showed that the gains were a little bit more wider spread than that. So still including healthcare and food services and drinking industries and also government, but adding in social assistance, transportation and warehousing, and even some gains in construction that are continuing. So we're looking to see how this labor market is evening out. The unemployment rate ticked up to 3.9% in February, along with the number of unemployed people increasing to 6.5 million. In comparison, this time last year, the jobless rate was 3.6%, and the number of unemployed was 6 million. So we're seeing some softness there. Among the major worker groups, unemployment rates for adult women and teenagers increased over the month. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. New data released on Thursday had also shown that first-time claims made for unemployment last week were relatively unchanged, but continuing claims were at their highest level since mid-November 2023. And so that's an indication of how hard or easy it is for unemployed workers to go out and get another job. The labor force participation rate was 62.5% for the third consecutive month. So the story here is no news is actually news, because we're just kind of stuck in terms of labor force participation and the employment to population ratio, which is the number of people out of the population who are actually working. That's been little changed at around 60% as well, and haven't really changed much over the year. And that's kind of been a little bit vexing to economists because our labor force participation rate is still about a percentage point below its pre-pandemic level and about 5 percentage points below hitting a high of 67% in early 2000. Earnings is one of the bigger data points that economists are watching today in Friday's report. Especially the pace of wage growth. Average hourly earnings were up 0.1% in February. That's compared to the big jump of 0.6% that we saw in January. But it looks like that might have been something that was driven more by the change in working hours that were related to some weather issues. So pretty much where we're at now is average hourly earnings growth of 4.3% year over year, which is back in line with what we were seeing in December. In terms of inflation, we won't really know how these wage gains stack up as of yet, because the next inflation report is due out on March 12th. But the reports for December and January showed inflation was cooling back then when we had our last report. But it's a little bit hotter than economists would like and still above the Fed's 2% target level. And then finally, looking at job openings, the BLS's latest jobs turnover data released on Wednesday showed that the quits rate, so that's the number of people quitting their jobs as a percentage of total employment, dipped to 2.1% in January. That's the lowest level since April 2020. That's usually also a sign of weakening in the labor market, where people, feel like they need to stay in their job rather than take a risk and look for another one. It also means that employers maybe don't have to be offering wage gains to be attracting workers as much as they were in the past. But still, the number of job openings, which is our measure of labor demand, remains well above pre-pandemic averages, right? So we're still somewhere in the order of about, 8.8, 8.9 million jobs. All right. So now that we've done the headline numbers, we really want to dip below what's going on and hear from our experts to give us some insight beyond those headlines. So, Elise, I'm going to start with you. Are this month's numbers good for workers, bad for workers, or are they a mixed bag?
I think when we look at the payroll survey, it's clear that they're good for workers. And I'll talk a little bit more about the two surveys in a minute. But I think when we think about overall, we see that job growth of 275,000. That's strong. It's stronger than the average that we saw for the prior 12 months, which was 230,000 jobs. And as you said, there were some downward revisions, both for December and January. But even so, we are at a pretty good pace. I would say these February gains are promising, especially, again, as some of you said already, is in healthcare and government. I think that government employment is a key sector we want to look at, particularly with state and local government, which have been lagging for so long. That's now up almost a full percentage point since February 2020. So after lagging for so long, it is promising to see those gains continue. So I think that's important. And then I do want to mention, when you look at the household survey, you see some losses there, actual outright losses in employment with this tick up in the unemployment rate. And I think that we don't want to look too closely at what is happening in that survey. Oftentimes, when the surveys diverge, they catch up a little bit the next month or the month after. And what is happening in the household survey is more of a blip and is some sort of idiosyncrasy that happens in that survey. We pay more attention to the payroll survey for a few reasons. One is it's a much larger sample. And so you're getting a much larger sample of establishments than a smaller sample of households. We also have a very clear benchmarking process that happens every year. So those are benchmarked to actual administrative unemployment insurance records. So it's a better survey for those two key reasons. And so that's the one we pay attention to. That's the one that we report top line employment growth from. And we pay a little bit less attention to the household survey on those top line numbers. So I would look away a little bit at what is happening in that survey, because I think that is important that we see how that develops, and you really want to look at longer term trends when you're looking at that survey. And the longer term trends are pretty clear. We are still at below 4% unemployment. That is tremendous. How long we have been historically, the longest stretch we've had at such really low unemployment rate. So I think that's important. And the third thing I want to mention is about nominal wage growth, right? The Federal Reserve is looking at all of these numbers, but nominal wage growth is the key number that they are looking at to see whether or not the economy is too hot. And it's clear from all the other measures that you've mentioned, higher softening, what is happening with UI claims, all of the other data is that we are not in an overheated labor market. And when we look at the overall numbers, it's very much in line with target levels of inflation, productivity growth, and maybe at 4.3%, maybe we're going to start to claw back some of that labor share with corporate profits still very high. So I'm pretty optimistic about this report.
All right, there you have it from the EPI. Teresa, I'm going to turn to you. What's your take on today's jobs report? Good for workers, bad for workers, mixed bag? What do you see?
I'm a little bit more cheered up when I heard Elise, because I see a softening trend. I was just ecstatic, as a person who looks for worker power in the last year or so. I never thought it would see unemployment rates so low. So Elise is right. You're right. We are still at eye-wateringly low unemployment rate, and we should be seeing wages keeping up with productivity. We should see wages keeping up or exceeding inflation, so that workers are actually better off. But I look at a couple of other indicators for worker power, and those numbers really are flashing red. So one thing I look at for this kind of high frequency data, it's not high frequency every day, but I get it every month, is what I call the take your job and shove it number, referring to the song by Johnny Paycheck, which is revealing of workers' sense and confidence that they can leave the job that they have now and just quit it and go, and they will find another one that pays as well or has the same kind of benefits and job conditions. I mean, it's pretty nervy to leave a job, you know, without having another one. And I think we told our students and our friends never to do that, but people are doing it, and they were really doing it a lot in 2021, 2022, up to 2023. But this month, there was an ouchie drop from 12.8% of people who are unemployed being job leavers, you know, meaning I'm unemployed because I quit that job, to now 11%. And that was a huge drop in the job leaver as a share of unemployed number. And I matched that up with that Thursday number you talked about, Alicia, the JOLTS number. A lot of people look at that quits rate number. I like to look at the correspondence between the two. And those quit rates numbers are also falling. They were high, you know, back in September 2022, where 16, you know, there was a very high turnover with people and quitting their jobs. But that's fallen a lot too. And it's fallen in almost all the industries. And then the good news is at the bottom of the labor market, leisure and hospitality still have a bit of power. You know, I can see glimmers of power there. Their wages are still going up. Their quit rates are not falling as fast. And we're adding a lot more jobs in that area too. So overall, it's softening. You know, I think the, you know, to be macro here, you know, the Fed might have expected this as well. Maybe they see other numbers. The Fed chief indicated that he may signal or encourage lowering interest rates to the extent, you know, that they can and influence that next year. And this is consistent with that kind of expectation.
Yeah, I think I usually try to look a little more on the optimistic side as well. And one of the things that I think about when I see that slowing job quits number is I like to think people found a job they liked. They found a good match, right? As opposed to I'm scared to leave my job right now. It's really hard to tell, right, without asking people. And so we're left with sort of this collage of evidence of where we might be. I guess for me, I think that these are still good numbers. You know, it's hard to argue with job growth that's over 200,000, even though there was a tick up in the unemployment rate. I think one of the things that I'm watching right now is just, you know, layoffs. There's kind of been mixed signals in terms of layoffs. You know, Challenger, Gray, and Christmas announced that, you know, this was the biggest February for announced layoffs since 2009. That makes me a little bit worried. However, you know, you might think like this is kind of limited or maybe just in certain sectors of the economy. And it's definitely true that, you know, the layoffs at tech giants are the things that are attracting all the headlines, and people are worried about AI and things like that. But, you know, there was that 28% slide in job postings for software development, 26% drop in information design and documentation, right? So there are these real pockets of weakness. And a lot of these firms that are laying off, they're citing things like restructuring, followed by closing, or market and economic conditions. So these seem to be like something structural that's happening, at least in some industries here and there. And one of the things that I worry about is the folks that do get chucked out from a layoff, are they able to get back in? And that's where I get a little concerned about that continuing claims number, right? Mm-hmm. Where folks might not be able to get back in as well. Also, this month, we saw that among the unemployed, the number of permanent job losers increased by 174,000 in February. So that's not something we've really been seeing very much in the past, right? Where people have lost a job and they've been stuck out of the labor market for a little while. But, you know, other sectors are still showing strong demand, right? Job postings are surging, you know, in healthcare, in government, in, you know, even things like engineering and construction. And so, like, if we look at the entire economy, layoff activity really remains pretty low everywhere. So I think, you know, that's always been our story coming out of the pandemic. Some industries are surging, some are not. It depends on where you are right now as to what labor market you are facing. But when we look at the top line numbers, you know, we're still in a strong economy. So I think I'm kind of with you there. Okay, let's go beyond the headline numbers. There's already been a lot of other chatter this morning, you know, on Twitter or in the press. but we've had a little bit more time to look more deeply into this report. So I'm looking for your stat of the day, my friends, that can give us some greater insight into the state of workers' lives. So Teresa, I'm going to start with you this time and ask you, what's your stat of the day? What's the thing you're keeping an eye on?
Yeah, no, as I hear you talk and I'm really poking around the numbers, I am worried about that increase in layoffs. So my stat of the day is table A11, where the share of job losers, has ticked up.
Yeah, I think that is something definitely for us to keep an eye on. And that again sort of goes to the unevenness I think we see in the economy. And that's probably why when you ask folks, how do you think the economy is doing? You sort of get these mixed signals, right? Because it really depends on who you are and where you are in that journey.
Yeah, and the stat is, 3.2 million. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
The number, right?
We're doing this in real time here, people.
Yeah.
Right? Elise, what is your stat of the day? What's the thing that you're digging in a little deeper on?
I think it has to be nominal wage growth, where we're looking at how tight the labor market is, what Federal Reserve policymakers are looking at, whether or not there's overheating. There's very clearly no signs of overheating. I think what we're seeing is wage growth. So no matter how you measure it, if you look at over the month, annualized, it's 1.8%. If you look at the 3-month change, annualized, that's 4%, 4.0%. Year over year, it's 4.3%. As I said, that's very consistent with the inflation targets and productivity growth. Maybe at 4.3%, we'll even claw back some of that labor share. I think it's important, especially to pay attention to this, because there was a lot of shock last month. Last month's pace of wage growth was clearly a blip, and we're now back to totally sustainable rates of wage growth consistent with that normalizing. And so when we think about the context of those layoffs, we think about the pace of hiring, and we think about all the other measures. I think when the Federal Reserve takes a look at that, it may be time really to be cutting those rates, because there may be issues with the economy being able to expand and absorb more workers at these high interest rates that we're at right now.
I'm sorry, Elise, so your number is 4.3 annual nominal wage growth? I didn't take a look at that. Is that it? Is that
That's correct? That's
okay,
correct.
Great. All right, sorry. I just wanted to.
The year over year is 4.3%.
Okay.
So that's very consistent with that 2% inflation target, long-term trend productivity growth. And we really want to be clawing back some of that labor share. As you mentioned, there are some that are getting faster wage growth, but wages are very low for many people in the economy. And it's very hard for many workers to make ends meet, even if they can get a job.
Yeah, and I think the important thing for us to remember as economists is like the lived experience of wage growth versus inflation growth, right? So the lived experience of wage growth is you get a bump up when you change a job. You get a bump up once a year, right? When you maybe get a review or you get a promotion or something like that. So you kind of have like one shot at this sort of as a worker, as opposed to, the inflation rate going up every month, right? Prices still keep marching up, and they keep marching up from the level that they were at, right? The month before, the year before. And so, I kind of really wonder if some of the, softness in consumer confidence or, not feeling great about the economy is just that even though the pace of prices is slowing down, right? It's not like workers themselves every single month are getting a little bit of an increase, or even, if they hit it at the right time, are getting an increase that's going to match up what's happened to prices over the last year. So,
yeah, I think that's a really great point. When we think about what is happening with this decelerating wage growth, people look at me and they think, why do you want, nominal wage growth to decelerate? Well, we're talking about nominal wage growth. We know that prices are falling. The rate of price growth, inflation, is coming down. And so real wages are actually rising. They have been rising for about 6 months now. And so that is promising. And I think that's why when we see a higher quits rate, we think that is promising, because that is how people do get some of those wage increases.
Exactly.
And, in lieu of having better union contracts, for instance, that's one of the best ways that workers can get wage increases, by taking another job or bidding up their wages that way. So.
Yeah, so we could look on the optimistic side that yes, folks are now in a job that fits them better, has better benefits and schedule and pay, right? Like we can hope for the best. For me,
that's so interesting. That's so interesting.
Oh, go ahead.
We really should poke that. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, we can definitely return to that as well. For me, the stat of the day, I guess I have two because I'm cheating because I'm the host. So I definitely have been looking at, unemployment rate for women since we turned off the subsidies for childcare, and I made this really bold prediction that we were going to see this in the labor report numbers in December, in January, and we didn't. And I was like, oh, great, I must be wrong. Well, we're seeing it in February. So we saw a tick up in the unemployment rate for women from 3.2 to 3.5%. We didn't see a similar tick up for men. And this really puts women back to where they were a year ago. And so I'm going to be digging in more even later today to be looking at labor force participation for women and thinking about, what does this mean going forward as we, continue to move into an economy where more of the federal funding for lots of things is getting shut down or is drying up as it's moved through the economy. And, unless we're willing to do something about childcare that's a little more sustainable, probably at the federal level, we're probably going to see this impacting families and women in particular. The other statistic that I've been looking at, just because of my interest in youth employment and youth workforce development, is, of course, the teen unemployment rate. That also ticked up from 10.6% to 12.5%. And again, we're kind of back to where we were last year. But notably, again, as we see any kind of softening in a labor market, teens are typically the canaries in the coal mine, if you will. They're the first to be fired, the last to be hired. So somewhat an indicator of the most marginal, who are, whether or not they're being able to be employed. And then even if we look below that number for all teenagers, if we look at the disparity by race, there was barely a blip up for white youth from 10.3 to 10.6% compared to really large jumps for Black and Hispanic youth. So we're talking going from like 11.5% unemployment to over 15%, almost 16% unemployment for Black and Hispanic youth. So, usually what happens is not only is it the case that we see teens being, kind of frozen out of the labor market as we go forward, but that the softness in the labor market just doesn't land the same depending on who you are. So as we wrap up here, I want to know a little bit more about the longer term view, right? So we've talked about, what's happening this month, what's happening right now with workers, but really the focus of the blogcast is to take a longer term view and understand what does this mean for worker power over time, right? So we have the advantage of maybe seeing a little bit further into the future. So Elise, what's your take? Have workers been gaining or losing power in 2024? What's your outlook for worker power for the next, 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, I think it's a great question when you think about the longer term, right? We had all the strike activity and the union organizing over the last year. I hope that some of that turns into better contracts. We're not seeing that in the data today, obviously, but we see that that takes some time as it is in sort of today's policy environment for those to really take effect. So I think that that's something we want to look forward to, and hopefully we'll see in future jobs reports. I think that when we think over the next few months, I really want to pay attention to what's happening in the household survey and make sure that is a blip and not some sort of slowing. And then what we see in the next few months depends on what policymakers do. So what will Federal Reserve policy be? Are they going to keep the recovery from continuing to develop by keeping interest rates too high? Or are they going to lower them and help spur on more growth? So I think there's a lot to watch in coming months.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point where, the Fed had been signaling, hey, in 2024, we're probably going to lower rates. There was talk about March. Now they're talking about delaying it a bit. And I think, it's a little like the anticipation gets pent up, right? So folks are talking about how this is becoming a bigger and bigger event as we wait longer for it, right? And so it could almost backfire on them the longer they wait, right? So if they wait longer to reduce rates, then all of a sudden releases all of this, investment energy, and then we're back into an inflationary kind of period, right? You kind of want to do this in a very orderly fashion, and it feels like we've got a short window to do that. Teresa, you get the final word before I answer. So chime on in there.
Yeah, so I'm seeing, we know there's a lot of inequality within enterprises, within firms. And in my own industry in higher education, it got addicted to low-wage labor. It got addicted to using student labor, in our classrooms, doing our research assistant. And the right now, my teaching assistants and research assistants are on strike. The part-time workers struck last year, and they got huge wage increases. So I think we'll see worker power in a very particular way, that we'll see big enterprises bringing up the bottom. So if that's the kind of worker power we're looking at, I'm seeing that won't really affect inflation. It'll just affect equity.
To affect equity if we can't affect inflation. I'm all for that. I guess, where I'm seeing things go over the next 6 to 12 months, I'm really hoping for like a meaningful soft landing. And I don't just mean like a soft landing that economists like, where it's like, hey, if this is where we're at with 3.9% unemployment and $200,000 jobs being created, that's a great thing. But really that it trickles down right through the economy in a way that, as we were talking, affects the most marginalized, that they are also stabilizing as well. And so one of the things that I've been looking at a little bit is, the Beige Book just came out from the Fed, and thinking again about that unevenness in the economy, and hoping that, maybe we're just seeing a stabilization, coming out of these most recent job reports where things are getting revised down, but they're still really strong. So for example, the Fed was saying, look, businesses are finding it easier to fill open positions, to find qualified applicants, there's less wage pressure. I think that's all okay, right? As long as this is like the stabilization of what we're seeing, rather than something that will accelerate into deteriorating labor market conditions, right? So I think that's what we're looking for. All right, so I'm going to bring the conversation to a close right there. I want to thank today's guests, Teresa Ghilarducci and Elise Gould, for their expert insights and their continued excellent work. I also want to thank our producer, Joe Brandt. And before you go, Seth Harris would be very cross with me if I did not ask you to subscribe to the Power at Work blog so we can keep you updated on all the great content that we're producing. And thanks for watching. We will see you back on the blog again 1 month from now when we do the numbers.
Thank you.
You can stay up to date with the latest news about workers, worker power, and unions by subscribing to the Power at Work blog. You'll receive the weekly download, a Power at Work newsletter sent straight to your inbox. The weekly download collects about 24 of the week's articles, academic studies, press releases, podcasts, and videos from across the internet. We find the stories and deliver them directly to you. So subscribe to the weekly download right now on the front page of the Power at Work blog. Go to poweratwork.us.